Welcome, colleagues. Welcome to this important debate on racism, a trade union response, how we can use the Black Lives Matter campaign's momentum to make our trade unions more effective at fighting racism and more inclusive for Black workers. I'm Patrick Roach, proud to be General Secretary of NSUWT, the Teachers Union, and also Chair of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force. And we have a fantastic lineup of panelists today. Frances O'Grady, of course, requires no introduction, TUC General Secretary and also a member of our Anti-Racism Task Force. Gloria Mills, Chair of the TUC Racial Relations Committee and Unison National Equalities Organiser. Gloria is also a member of our task force. Dr. Faiza Shaheen, Programme Lead on Inequality and Exclusion for Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. I'm really pleased that Faiza has joined us from New York, I understand. And Faiza is also formerly Director of CLASS, the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. We've got Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Deputy Mayor of London for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement. Really pleased also to have Debbie as a member of our task force. And we have Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want. You all know War on Want, the charity that's working to end global poverty and human rights abuses. I want to thank our panelists for agreeing to be with us today. And in memory of George Floyd, I will be giving each panel member up to 8 minutes to say a few words. And I will be keeping colleagues to time in order that we can open the floor to questions from you. And I believe that the Q&A function is available for you to post your questions to the panel. I want to start just simply by saying that we all know in this room, this virtual room, that Black workers have made history. They've made a real difference to our trade unions by their organising in their workplaces, sometimes working together in solidarity with other trade unionists, sometimes working alone when we had to. Our generation of Black union activists stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before, like Bill Morris, Eunice Chowdhury, and Claudia Jones. Ours isn't the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, and everyone has to play their part. It really is prescient that our trade unions are coming together at this Black Workers' Conference to advance a progressive agenda for anti-racism on the eve of Anti-Racism Day and on the anniversary of the first UK coronavirus lockdown. And since last year, we've seen the country plunged into a health emergency, an economic emergency, but also a racial justice emergency. We've seen a public health crisis and the government's response to it, reopening deep wounds of structural racism that continue to blight and scar our society and our economy. Structural racism is at work in our workplaces and in our unions, holding back our communities and blighting life chances. Black communities have been systematically failed by a government response that was supposed to protect us all during the pandemic. And you know all of the statistics. 3 to 4 times more likely to die as a result of COVID-19, twice as likely to be made unemployed, paid less, working in precarious and unsecure employment. Young people from Black backgrounds more likely to be unemployed regardless of the qualifications that they hold. As many of us experienced in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher's government, young black people once again face a very real prospect of being left behind. History is in danger of being repeated. Across the board, Black workers are bearing the brunt through the losses in job losses through this pandemic. And our communities continue to endure racist attacks on our streets and in the education system, we've seen how systemic racism continues to damage the lives of Black children. So as Black workers, communities, and trade unions, we want no more excuses. And we know that there is work for our movement to do too. The majority of Black workers who experience racist incidents choose not to report it to their employer. And as the TUC's Dying on the Job report found last year, just 8% of Black workers sought help from their union when faced with racism at work. So our unions must not only be a safe space for Black workers, we've also got to win the confidence and the trust of Black workers. We've got to build our movement, transform our workplaces, and our unions must demonstrate that we are prepared to stand up to racism at work and in our communities. And that will mean developing tools, plans, strategies, and leadership that will make the difference. Last year, we saw a tidal wave of national and international response in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. With wider civil society, our trade union movement has demanded change. And that's what our unions are doing through the work of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force, because we won't stand by whilst racism continues to operate. We must continue to shine a light on the epidemic of racism. But I want us to do more than that. We have to focus on action. That's what our movement is all about. Working to build a new generation of activists focused on anti-racist campaigning, organising and bargaining in the workplace, working in tandem with civil society organisations. And we'll be taking action, building on the work of the Stephen Lawrence Task Group 20 years ago to ensure that our unions lead by example. And during the life of the task force, we will also be asking all unions to pledge action, delivering an agenda for change, not only on behalf of Black workers, but on behalf of all of our members. And we want this Black Workers Conference to help steer that process with the active engagement of the TUC Race Relations Committee and the leadership of the General Council. You will be helping the Anti-Racism Task Force to define our agenda and our priorities, how we build stronger unions with reps who are equipped and committed to delivering a progressive agenda for racial justice at work, how we challenge our movement to do better, how we should be campaigning for stronger legislation and protections for Black workers, and how we advance racial justice in the labour market and win for our Black members and for all workers. So I'm sure that this conference will tell us how we do that over today and tomorrow, and tell us the priorities that we must set and take forward in our work over the coming months. And I look forward to your contributions, your ideas, your proposals today and throughout the rest of this conference. So now to our speakers, and I want to invite Frances O'Grady to address this panel first. Frances, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and a big warm welcome from me to everybody joining us online. We're a movement that's 6 million strong, but we want to get even bigger and stronger. And I just want to start, Patrick, because I think we should continue to do this, of sending a massive thank you to all our key workers in the NHS, in social care, but right across the piece, supermarkets, transport, refuse collectors. And we know that Black and ethnic minority people are much more likely to be key workers and to be on that COVID front line, which means that they were putting their health and continue to put the health of themselves and their families on the line for the rest of us. And very often, as we know at the start of this crisis, they didn't even have proper protective equipment to do that. They're also much more likely to be on insecure contracts, like 0 hours and full self-employment, which means they're much less likely to get even basic sick pay when people need to take time off sick or self-isolate. So, you know, I will keep saying this, key workers cared for us. It's time we cared for them. And to be honest, after those announcements on the defence review yesterday, if the government's got money for more nuclear warheads, then why haven't they got the money to give all our key workers a decent, real pay rise? But just on that point, because I think this is about more than money, it says something really profound about how we value people and how deep racism runs. And that's why, again, I think all of us have to keep pressing that call for an independent public inquiry, including into the racism that we saw in the handling of this pandemic and why it is that Black and ethnic minority communities have paid an even higher price. So we need that independent public inquiry. And I know I can count on everybody on this call to raise our voices to get it. This week, Patrick, we had another reminder, didn't we, with the policing bill passed through Parliament. And let's make no bones about it. This bill, which is an anti-democratic bill designed to crack down on our right to protest. It was conceived in response to those Black Lives Matters protests. So let's be honest about what the origin of this bill is. It's really, it's gobsmacking really in terms of the new powers it's seeking to take. There's even a new offence called serious annoyance. And to be frank, as many other people have commented, if serious annoyance was an offence, half the cabinet would be banged up tomorrow. But it has backfired badly, I think. We saw that mishandling of the vigil in response to the death of a woman, the murder of a woman walking home. We've seen how those women at the vigil were treated. And I think it shocked everybody. And I think it is important to say this, that I think the Labour Party was quite right in pointing out that it comes to something when you can get 10 years in jail for toppling a statue glorifying slave traders, or what we would call nowadays people traffickers. Imagine that you can get 10 years for toppling a statue like that, and yet you can only get 5 years for raping a real live woman. What does that say about our values? I think it says the government's got its priorities all wrong. And please also just allow me to also point out in this bill is the nastiest attack on gypsy and traveller communities that we've seen for a long time. Communities who have no resources in terms of local authorities setting up sites. Local authorities have no duty to set up sites. Most of them don't. And yet it's the communities that are going to get hammered by this bill. Today, the TUC put out yet another report showing how Black and ethnic minority workers face discrimination in the jobs market in terms of who gets a job, who's last in, first out, who's least likely to get promotion, and so on. But I think it's right to say, as you've said, Patrick, and I feel a responsibility for this personally, is that we have got to lead from the front as a movement, and we cannot lecture others if we don't get our own house in order. I mean, I was absolutely delighted to see that the PFA, one of our affiliates, has just elected another Black leader, trade union leader. So looking forward to working with them in the future. But let's be honest, we have not got the representation at every level of the movement, in every walk of life, that we need to see. And this isn't just some kind of moral duty. This is because we know as working people that our opponents always set out to divide us. And the way that we can confound that division is by being equal amongst ourselves, uniting together and standing up against racism together, including exposing that obscene race pay gap. 24% in London. You know, we have got to get that out on the table, blow the doors open, and use our power to tackle it. And just finally, from this week, which has been such a big week, you know, we were all disappointed today in terms of yet again social care workers being denied even the minimum wage for those sleep-in shifts. But we should take some heart from that fantastic landmark Supreme Court ruling on Uber that has implications for the gig economy across the piece. Everybody knows if you're Black and ethnic minority, if you're a migrant worker, you're much more likely to end up working in the gig economy. And this was a famous victory from union-backed cases to establish that the whole idea that these workers were self-employed was bogus. They should have worker status. And worker status gives you the right to the national minimum wage, to paid holidays and sick pay, and critically, the right to be accompanied by a trade union when you meet the boss. That is worth fighting for. We can see that Uber very generously said it's now going to pay the minimum wage, but it's wriggling about on the hook because they're saying they shouldn't have to pay from the first minute that people are working. But the Supreme Court was very clear. As soon as you log on, you're working and you should be entitled to be paid at least the minimum wage. So we have some important battles ahead. We've got to get anti-racism on our campaign agendas, on our collective bargaining agendas, but critically, final plea from me, we have got to organise. That is the way that we win power for Black workers, for all workers, is by building our movement. So let's get to it. Thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, Frances, for that really inspiring address. And organise, so that we can blow the doors open. I think the quote was blow the doors or the bloody doors off, but anyway, that's another matter. Gloria Mills. Gloria is chair of the TUC Race Relations Committee and Unison National Equalities Organiser, and also I'm proud to say a member of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force. Gloria, I'll invite you to address colleagues.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, friends and colleagues, and also thank you, Patrick, and thanks to Frances for her opening remarks and her contribution and the speech and the direction and vision she has actually laid out. I think it's really important that we look at the issue of structural racism because of the fact that it perpetuates the barriers, as Patrick rightly said, it's holding Black people back every day, blighting their ambitions and aspirations. But I think we're looking now at how the trade union movement respond. And I think, it's really important that across the globe and within the UK and within the European Union as well, that we have concrete actions being taken to deal with some of these issues. So I want to say that what we want is to see us moving from words to action. We have to make that fundamental leap from words to action because we have seen enough lip service over the years, and we need a new change, a new direction, and we need to have real change. And in order to do that, because Black workers, they've seen the TUC report today, they recognize and they appreciate the fact that it's actually stating exactly what's happening in Britain today. But this has been happening for over 50 years, the last half a century and more. And it says affected every generation have been affected by the racism that we are seeing. And it's becoming stronger, it's becoming more entrenched, and it's becoming more embedded. So in terms of the trade unions and the task force, we must move from words to action. And the TUC response must be also, in addition to the government's response that we are demanding in terms of having a comprehensive action plan and strategy, we must also have a comprehensive action plan and strategy encompassing all areas of our work. So we need to do more than talk. We need to walk that talk. And that means that, you know, we must acknowledge the experience, the knowledge and the power and influence that we have in the workplace, because it's in the workplace we have the greatest power to make the most important changes that will improve the lives of Black workers. And what we need to do is to recognize that at every stage of the process, from recruitment to redundancy, every stage is infected with race discrimination. You know, you have employers recruiting, and now some of the big employers have said to me they're no longer recruiting candidates by names. They're actually using recruitment numbers for candidates because they find that they get more applicants coming through and more successful candidates when they recruit people on the basis of numbers rather than names, because they have to filter out a lot of the discrimination in artificial technology and in AI, because, you know, AI is actually loaded with a lot of discrimination in terms of who it selects. I mean, you just, you know, facial recognition, all of these things. I mean, it's really loaded with every bias, gender bias. We've seen it happening in a number of universities and from the UK across the world, where, you know, it's weighted, the factors that they're using are weighted against certain groups, and it means that they're coming out with lower scores than the average. And so we have to be conscious and we have to be aware of that. And we also have to be conscious and aware of the fact that last in, first out, LIFO is really discriminatory in the way that it actually applies. It breaches the Section 139 of the Employment Rights Act in terms of how redundancies should actually take place. Redundancies and restructuring tend to be used as an opportunity to get rid of Black workers when you're starting from a very low base of Black workers who have got their jobs on merit. So we need to deal with that. And I want to say three things in terms of how we take this forward. I think we need a strategy that will have we need to have, like national employers and the government, we need to have our own, develop and implement our own national action plans in trade unions. We need to do it, we need to have a sector specific approach to it. We need every sector to have an action plan to deal with all of the issues of racism in terms of recruitment, progression, precarious employment, poverty, zero-hour contracts. So we need to map and we need to monitor what's happening. But every trade union as well, their negotiating committee at company level needs to look at what action plans, what are the grievances, who are making the complaints, and to start dealing with these. These are collective bargaining issues, and it's no good saying that we are, we have the power of influence and to make decisions and to bargain when we are not using it to protect the groups of workers that are being discriminated against. And Black workers tell you all the time that they feel alone, they feel they fight in this battle alone, and if the unions were to intervene, then these issues will be resolved. So we need that, and we need a strategy that will educate. And when we need a strategy to educate, to negotiate, and to litigate. We educate because we train thousands of our reps to take up the places in order to do the cases, the representation, and the organization and collective bargaining at the workplace. And we need to set out the negotiating priorities, register the collective disputes and the collective grievances, and to be the first port of call for Black workers experiencing bullying, harassment, and discrimination in the workplace. And as a last resort, we need to have a litigation strategy to defend and protect Black workers where there are groups of Black workers facing discrimination in the workplace. And we need to engage with the Black workers to discuss what the priority issues are. I'm hoping that this weekend, some of those priorities will come forward and we will be engaging with people. And as we used to say in the civil rights movement, nothing about us without us, but also to recognize what Eldridge Cleaver said: if you are not part of the solution, you are the problem. And we must make sure that the trade union movement has the solutions to deal with this problem of endemic, systemic, structural, institutional racism. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Gloria. A real, I think, call to arms there from Gloria. Definitely, we want to be doing that with our Black members and through this conference to develop those priorities, those objectives, and to begin to frame those plans that Gloria referred to. Educate, negotiate, litigate. Certainly, hear those words are ringing in my ears. So next on our panel is Faiza Shaheen, and Faiza is program lead at Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. Faiza, the floor is yours. From New York, I understand as well, so fantastic.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And, you know, I always hate following either Francis or Gloria in these panels, and then both of them together is really hard. It's a really tough act to follow. Just quickly to say, yeah, when I was asked to do this, I knew I would be in New York at this time. I'm back and forth over the next 6 months or so. But the Black Workers Conference is my favorite place to speak. And always any Black Workers Conference, whether it was I spoke at one at CW or NEU. They're just my favorite places to be. So I knew I wanted to be here, even if it's a bit tricky, and hopefully my internet will be fine. So just to remind everyone, I was the director of CLASS, the trade union think tank, for 5 years. And it was really a very important time and a very proud connection with the trade union movement, and I still feel very much part of that. But I guess I'm here to talk about something that's a bit difficult to talk about and for us to hear sometimes, which is really how Black Lives Matter and more broadly how we are talking about racism is being tied into the culture war, and how whilst many of us rejoiced seeing those statues come down, seeing the young people out on the streets, it really just made me feel so proud and happy. You know, when they did the polls to see how the broader public reacted, 55% said that Black Lives Matter had increased racial tensions. And I really think it's important for us as a trade union movement to think about this context, this very difficult context, and where we've somehow become the baddies. I mean, it's unbelievable. And anyone that talks about racism now, and you know, I've been doing this for some time, it's notable how much more hate you get now when you talk about these things publicly. And quite honestly, I've stepped back from doing media for a while, and I'm partly doing this New York thing for the next year because it's really hard out there. And it's really important for us to think not just about Black workers in the workplace, but also in wider society, and thinking about what we as a movement can do to shift the dial and get people to understand the importance of racism, and to admit that what we're doing so far, whilst there's lots to be proud of, also has been twisted by the right. And so far, we don't have any answers to that. We're losing that public battle in terms of getting people to understand why equality is something that we'd all benefit from. And I want to just talk about, I think, 3 areas where I think we should be doing more and talking more explicitly about change and trying to appeal more broadly. It's really important that we have this place here. This is why I love speaking at Black Workers Conference, because I gain so much strength and learn so much from my fellow Black comrades, but we also can't just do this in isolation, and we need to look beyond. So 3 things that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So one is, and this is kind of easier for the trade union movement to do is to make it about capitalism, to make it about care workers and pay and nurses, you know, because there is a conversation that happens about representation and justice, and those are so key and absolutely important. But often that part of how the economy is working and who it's working for is lost. And the beauty of doing that and talking about capitalism, talking about the number of Black workers in 0-hour contracts, and to talk about more broadly about minimum wages, is that it also allows us to talk about the working class. And, you know, that's my second big point, is that we have to talk about race and class. We have to find a way to talk about working class experiences and talk about how that working class is multi-ethnic. This is something that I've been talking about for a few years now, you know, this absolute frustration with how class has become a conversation about the white working class, and completely pitted against the Black and brown immigrant working class people, even though shared experiences in the workplace are so universal in many ways. And just to bring out some work that we did while I was at class, where we spoke to the multi-ethnic working class, and what we kept hearing again and again was about 4 areas where people felt that their lives were difficult. And one of them was precariousness. Yes, 0-hour contracts, housing. We heard that regardless of race, and that was about the working class experience. We heard about power and lack of power. You know, people really feel that in their lives. And so we've got to have answers to that. Oh, someone started to drill, great. Thirdly, they spoke about prejudice. They spoke about, and that was true of all of the working class groups, but there was an added dimension of racism, of course there was. And they felt that prejudice, and this is really difficult for us. Is that noise really bad? Can you hear me still? You can still hear me, okay, great. The thing that was difficult for us to hear in that study is Black, white, you know, working class people were finding that the prejudice they felt most was often from the state and public services. And that was really difficult for us to hear, because obviously this, especially benefits office and the way in which the state is working right now, is to judge people constantly. And finally, the power of place and the importance of belonging. Now, those things came across, as I say, across the working class. So how can we find a way to talk about working class experiences, not to negate race? And I really hate it when, you know, fellow comrades get in touch with me and say, that's not about racism, it's about class. Racism exists on its own, and middle class and upper class people will also, Black people will also found racism. But for us as a movement, how do we talk about the working class? How do we build solidarity? How do we get the working class to stand up for each other and recognize racism? And I think that's really a critical place in which only really us can make that argument in an authentic way. And then how do we then feed that into the reps? So they are out there making these arguments. So I'll never forget this. It must have been about 3 or 4 years ago. I was at a TUC conference, and class had an event, and a rep from a union put their hand up and said, when we were during the Brexit referendum, when we were asked to talk about to our fellow workers about how they would vote, we were told that when people bring up immigration, which came up a lot, we were told to just change the subject. And I think the union movement has learned a lot since then, and I don't think they would get that same advice now. But how can we educate our reps, Black and white, to have this conversation and make sure that people are able to engage and feel brave enough? I know I've spoken at other conferences in the last few years where people have said to me, I want to have this conversation, I just don't know what to say. So how do we take what we know works on getting people to understand the importance of racism and really get people on the ground, in the pubs, on the school gates, you know, to have that conversation, because that's the only way it's going to work. One thing I learned from knocking on thousands of doors during the general election in an area that was predominantly white was that people hear this message much stronger from people they trust and they like. You know, there's a job of getting them to like you first before they're going to hear you on racism. Not long before we got shut down for the second lockdown in November, a guy came up to me in Hymes Park in the constituency in which I ran and said, oh, you know, I voted Tory, but I would have, you know, I thought you would be a great MP. And anyway, we started having this conversation, and he said, well, you guys need to stop talking about racism so much. And and it takes a lot of patience to have this conversation, by the way, you know. But I said, but racism is real. And because we'd already had a nice conversation about the lack of opportunity for working class kids, I could then go on and have a conversation about racism. I could talk about the fact that it's even harder for Black working class kids. So I think that's why it's so important to get our reps to do the messaging, because they're known and they're trusted. So those are the three big things I think that we need to do to make it about capitalism, to talk about race and class, and to educate our reps. And I know some of this is happening already, but if we can just like put a lot of energy behind that, that's really the only way we're going to turn this around in terms of that culture war and how uncomfortable it's getting in the UK. And, you know, just talking to my US colleagues here and being here the last couple of weeks, you know, it's noticeable how far along they are in that argument and winning people here. Not to say, I mean, there's a lot of problems here, of course, but they really are putting everything in order and pushing back very strongly. And I don't think we have that same level of understanding of how the culture war is working here or working in the UK. Finally, and I wanted to say this because I can't comment as much about what needs to happen within the trade union movement. But again, I think it was the 2019 Labour Party conference, we had Class held a session on race and class. And it genuinely broke my heart to see my Black comrades, my Muslim comrades stand up time after time in that session and talk about their experiences within work, within the trade union movement and within the Labour Party that were very painful for them. I don't know what happened in that session. We were talking about research, but it just became this time a session of airing grievances. And I would really say that we need to rethink and open up more spaces for Black workers to have that voice within the movement. It was so apparent, it really affected me afterwards to hear so many people in so much pain feeling like they weren't being listened to. And I think I just wanted to say that whilst we've got Francis and Patrick on the call. Yeah, and those are the main things, and absolutely agree about the need to just grow the trade union movement. Power is what it's all about, and we need to have that power. And you know, I never stop. I was going through the airport and a couple of workers there in security were talking about the union, and one was saying, I don't see the point, and the other one was saying, he's part of the union. And I just couldn't help but butt in and try and get in there and be like, the unions gave us the weekend, and two Black workers, I should say. And, you know, we've got to stand together. And I just couldn't, so my husband was dragging me away. And I was like, no, you know, absolutely. Everywhere we go, we need to be organizing. We need to be having this conversation about the importance of trade unions. And all the work I'm doing right now at the international level with 10 different countries around the world, it keeps coming up. It's all about power. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Faiza, for those words, and particularly for laying down that challenge about how we fight back in relation to the culture war, not only within our workplaces, but within our communities as well, and for giving us those three important steers in terms of things that we need to address if we're going to win that battle within our movement and across wider society. Next, we've got Debbie Weeks-Bernard. Debbie is Deputy Mayor of London for social integration, social mobility and community engagement. And I'm really pleased that we've also got Debbie. She's agreed to be a member of the Anti-Racism Task Force as well. So Debbie, over to you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's also, it's lovely to be part of such an inspiring panel of speakers and listening to Faiza, to to Gloria, also to Francis, and yourself, has made me a bit worried about what I'm going to say next, but was also sort of reaffirmed that I think that what the TUC is doing with its anti-racism task force by having this discussion at Black Workers Conference is so incredibly important. And so I'm really pleased to be a part of this discussion. And I'm going to apologize because the sun is really chasing me around my room at the moment. So I really hope that you guys can see me, and if not, at least that you can hear me. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk, I think, a little bit about why it's so important to focus on anti-racism and using proactive anti-racism as a way of tackling structural racism, and why it's important for us to be having these kind of conversations now at this time in the middle of this pandemic, and in the wake of what happened last summer, and also to say a little bit about what I think that the TUC as a movement can do, and how it can contribute really effectively to the way in which we try to reduce those race inequalities that have really opened up during this pandemic, but were there before and have been there for such a long period of time. And I was really struck by what Faiza was saying just before about the ways in which, quite frankly, we are in the middle of this culture war, and the way in which it's actually become even more difficult to have a practical, tangible conversation about race and racism anywhere, in any area of life at this particular moment. And I think it's really difficult for us in London, given that we have such a diverse city. It's a city where you've got 43% at the last census are from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background, but 75% of kids in our schools are non-white British. And we have a city which is incredibly diverse, but it's also a city which has been almost earmarked as being woke, as being a city in which it's the only place where people talk about this stuff. And elsewhere in the UK, we're not concerned about racism. We're only interested in levelling up or regional inequalities. And so it's become even more difficult to have a conversation about race, which is incredibly important to the people who live and work in that city because it is so diverse. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that also, about why it's important to have a focus on anti-racism in a city like London, in the middle of not just a pandemic, but a political discourse where we are being told that racism no longer exists, that race does not drive the experiences that people are having within our labour markets, that they're having within our schools, that they're having on our streets. And that's why I think us having this conversation now and carving out the role for the TUC as being an organisation that can speak up on behalf of those who will say, actually, structural racism is preventing me from being able to thrive, from being able to realise my potential, is incredibly important, because there's a proper vacuum nationally around the sorts of discussions around race and racism that we need to be having. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what I think it is that the TUC can do in this space, but also I wanted to re-emphasize a couple of things, and I wanted to draw on London as an example. Now, London is it's a wealthy place, right? So people always say, when we're talking about the ways in which funds are distributed to different parts of the UK, London should definitely not be a place that gets access to anything. But we do have huge wealth disparities in our city. And we also have some of the highest rates of child poverty in the whole of the country. And we have communities who have been completely ravaged by COVID-19. And COVID-19 has really, it shone a light on inequalities, which all of us who are attending today, who are on this panel, know were in existence before the pandemic hit. But it's because there was a lack of real proper acknowledgement of what drives those inequalities for people who come from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds that we have seen it have that impact on their lives and on their livelihoods. And it's the fact that if you are Black or Asian, you are more likely to be working in work that is public facing, that you cannot do from home, that exposes you to the risk of COVID-19, and has in part largely contributed to the way in which it took a disproportionate number of lives of those who come from Black and brown backgrounds, and also has had a hugely detrimental impact on their livelihoods. And we know that around 50% of Black men across our country were working in those sectors that were shut down during the first lockdown. So we already know that COVID-19 has impacted on the ability of people to work, as well as the ability of people to lead healthy lives. And in London, the reason that it's so important to have a focus on anti-racism is because that relationship between race and financial hardship is inextricably linked. And it was really interesting because Faisal was talking about the way in which there is a tendency to talk about the working classes as though they're white, as though they're monoethnic. And it's been clear for decades that there is a very close relationship between coming from a minority ethnic background and living in poverty. And the argument has been that if you find yourself experiencing difficulties in the labour market and you come from a Black or Asian background, it's got a large part to do with your income, with the background, with the place in which you were born. But structural racism is the reason that you have so many people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds living in poverty. And that's why speaking with an anti-racist voice or speaking through an anti-racist lens is so important, particularly in the city in which I live and the city in which I know the inequalities have really, really opened up. So there's a couple of things that I think, or there's a couple of ways that I think that the TUC can play a really important role in trying to tackle some of these inequalities for Black workers in London, but also elsewhere. The first is the kind of leading by example piece. And I know it's something that the anti-racism task force is particularly interested in looking at ways in which we can ensure the TUC and all of the affiliated trade unions can look within themselves to see where are Black and Asian workers represented, are they in senior positions? What levels of support are they receiving? And I think that this is a really good moment for the TUC to be able to say that it will lead by example. And I actually think it's important for all big institutions, and the GLA is no stranger to that, to be able to look within itself and look at where across the piece, people from different backgrounds are distributed in terms of the types of pay they're receiving, the types of jobs they're doing, how many senior leaders do you have that come from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. But the second thing, and I've alluded to it before, that I think the TUC can play a really important role in is that lobbying piece, is that being that voice for Black workers, but also being that voice for civil society and for others who are working really hard in these spaces. So by joining those campaigns and amplifying them, and I know, for example, the Running Me Trust has this campaign that it's launching alongside lots and lots of other organisations around getting the socioeconomic duty to be enacted, which is part of the Equality Act, which is something that should have happened when the Equality Act first came into force, but did not because of political rhetoric at the time. So it's incredibly important that you are able to talk about socioeconomic background as a protected characteristic and be able to use that when seeking to protect yourself and protect your rights in employment and elsewhere. But the second thing that I think that the TUC can also help to do is to really reinforce how important it is for workers who come from different backgrounds to have economic security, to ask the government, to get the government or compel the government to have a better conversation and policy about seeking to protect not just workers' rights, because we know that there are workers who are most likely to experience workforce exploitation, but to compel employers to pay their workers a good wage and to give them good levels, good quality work. We know, for example, that in the autumn, when the furlough scheme comes to an end, there is going to be a huge drive to just try to get lots of people into work. And the issue remains that we cannot just have our Black and Asian workers getting into any type of work, because that is why we have so many who are working in jobs which are low paid and which there are no reasonable routes to progression. We have to ensure that the rush to get people into work is to get them into work that pays well, and work that they enjoy doing, and work that allows them to progress, and work in workforces who recognise how important it is to have proper diversity within their workforces. And so that's an incredibly important role that I think that the TUC can play in trying to ensure that the way in which we look at our workforce post-autumn is a set of workforces in which Black and Asian and minority ethnic workers are properly distributed. But we can also ask the government to do that proper important work around pay gaps. And Francis mentioned the astronomically high ethnicity pay gap that we have in London. We need to make sure that ethnicity pay gap reporting is made mandatory. It's something that we've been asking the government to do for years, and they have refused to do so. And not only does it need to be mandatory, it should be something that all organisations do, regardless of how many people work within them. So at the moment, it's only for workforces that have 250 employees or more. Why is it 250 employees or more? We know people who are experiencing racism and other forms of exploitation in workforces which are smaller than that. So it needs to be mandatory. It needs to be mandatory for all. It needs to be enforceable when people say, I'm sorry, I am not going to report my ethnicity pay gap because I don't have enough Black workers in my team. That's not good enough. So we need to have a way of making sure that we hold employers to account when they fail to report, and also alongside that to make sure that people have a set of clear actions on action plans for how they're going to reduce the ethnicity pay gaps, which I am sure exist up and down the country. And the final thing that I'm going to say that I think that the TUC can really help to do around the issue of the labour market is to compel government to build community trust by getting them to, quite frankly, enact or put into place recommendations that have come from previous reports that they have commissioned. So get the government to fulfill the recommendations of the Lammy Review, get the government to fulfill the recommendations of the McGregor-Smith Review. I know we are currently waiting for the Commission on Race and Ethnicity to tell us the result of its consultation, but many of us said we don't need another commission and we don't need another report. We just need the government to enact the findings of reports on race inequalities across our country that they haven't yet done. I think that there's a lot of work to do, but the TUC is in a really good place to be able to speak up on behalf of workers and to compel government to do what they need to do to build trust for those workers, but also to show them that it is possible to have an anti-racist society without people thinking that it's only the loony lefties that would ever talk about such a thing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Debbie, for those words, and in particular for those words, both in terms of challenge and support to the TUC and to affiliated unions, and also that call, which I'm sure is echoed by the Black Workers Conference. We don't need more reports, we need action. And I think that's a message that we all must take very much to heart. I'm going to move to our final speaker, and that's Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want. Sorry that you've been kept waiting, Asad, and it's always a daunting task to be the last speaker in the row, but we look forward to hearing what you've got to say to us. Asad, the floor's yours.
No, and thank you, Patrick. And it's always an honour to follow so many amazing sisters of struggle and comrades. And I always feel like, oh God, I don't need to say anything because everything's been said by everybody else so eloquently. First of all, solidarity greetings, of course, from War on Want. War on Want was founded by the labour movement and continues to be rooted in the labour movement. It was the workers' charity that focused on the root causes of poverty, injustice and inequality around the world, and recognised that the struggle for workers' rights was at the heart of that, and very much took a with both a race, class and internationalist perspective over our 70th, and this year is our 70th anniversary for the last 70 years. Look, so much has been already said, and we know that the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that we've seen, you know, have shone a spotlight on racism, both the everyday racism, individual racism, and of course the really important focus on structural racism, and have began to open up this wider conversation about how racism is baked into our systems, both past and present, but also importantly, it opened up that challenge. How do we ensure it doesn't disfigure our future? And I don't think we should underestimate the scale of the challenge that we face. And as Patrick so eloquently put in his opening remarks, you know, the COVID pandemic has simply illustrated all of that, right? The racial and gendered and economic inequalities that determined who lived, who dies, who was on the front line, who were able to protect themselves and their families, who have faced a year of poverty and of debt and of job losses. And yet, and this is before we even truly grapple with the climate crisis and what that will mean for within our own societies and between our societies. And, you know, we already can see the environmental injustices of pollution, of low life expectancy that affects the Black communities. And of course, who is going to pay the price of the green transition that we all know is needed? And the UK, like many other countries all around the world, you know, are facing this really moment of, and it's a moment of what I call multiple crises. And it's the crisis of inequality, it's the crisis of COVID, it's the crisis of climate, and it all reinforces and amplifies all the existing injustices of racial and gendered inequalities and racism. And you know, and we should also recognize that this, of course, is also a moment of huge resistance. We talked about Black Lives Matter. We've seen the huge protests are happening also around climate. And of course, hats off to the Black women who, you know, were really at the forefront of leading this resistance on Priti Patel's new bill and on the attack on the right to protest and organize. And I think it's a real testament that if the government is not able, hasn't been able to rush through this bill like it was planned, it's because of the organized resistance that it faced. And I don't think we should ever fail to understand the power that we have, and that when we can come together collectively, actually is an incredible amount of power. And within all of that conversation around power, you know, we should also, of course, the trade union movement is the largest social movement that we have, right? And any question about social transformation or building power that doesn't include the trade union movement really isn't fit for purpose, because, you know, we would be fighting with one arm tied behind our back. And so when we're thinking about, you know, how we meet those challenges, and Pfizer really set them, you know, really explained that. And I think absolutely that the other side is not passive in this moment, right? It's engineering a culture war, which is, of course, anything but about culture, right? It's about breaking and dividing working people. It's about weakening the possibility of effective opposition and our ability also to be able to pose an alternative to this racialized inequality and injustice and the inevitable austerity that we're going to face. So I want to just very briefly touch on a few points in there. I think for the trade union movement, and it's long been, of course, argued by Black trade unionists for a long time, you cannot see race as being separate or stand in isolation from the very conception and understanding and our narratives around workers' rights, right? We have never understood race as being separate from class, or class as being separate from race. And I think that's a very, very important thing that the trade union movement must really instill in all of it's done. And I want to pay tribute, because of course there is amazing work that the trade union movement is doing. As One-on-One, we work with a lot of trade unions, particularly around the campaigns around Amazon and McDonald's and McStrike. And I think there's a lot of lessons for us to really build on, about how, you know, you understand exploitation, how you connect racial harassment and sexual harassment and safety at work, how you platform workers themselves, the multiracial workforce, to be able to tell a very, very different story about the working class than the working class that story that we're told that the working class is white and that black and minority communities are somehow separate. I think it's also about the importance of creating this racially inclusive idea of the working class, I think must sit at the heart of all of our thinking in everything that we do, and not simply about how do we talk about including more black workers, but actually how does the trade union movement and all progressive movements address this moment of multiple crises. And of course, look, this isn't new, right? I mean, I think those of us who've been around for a long while would always say, you know, is it just simply history repeating itself? But there are amazing moments in our past that we can also draw on. You know, as War on Want, one of our, we were proud to stand with the Grunwick workers, and I know, and of course, large parts of the trade union movement did so at that time. And there've been pivotal moments where the trade union movement coming in on those struggles really did challenge that notion of what is the working class, and did create and build those unities that we need. And so the trade union movement is really, really critical in that fight. And I think often in the trade union movement, there's sometimes I would say it's easy for us to focus only on the far right, right? And of course, it's really important that we focus on the far right, but without then understanding that actually part of that focus on the far right has also got to be challenging this normalization of racism, which is feeding into the far right. And as Pfizer quite rightly said, I think that really was illustrated in the Brexit in the Brexit fight, right? That unless the trade union movement was taking on this normalization of racism, and particularly how it was being articulated in terms of around migration, that it would actually ultimately weaken us all in terms of all of the progressive movement. So that's one area. Now, again, both Francis and others have all talked about the dangers of this hourglass workforce that we are seeing being created in terms of these hierarchies of precariousness, of migration status, of creating this racialized and gendered division of labor, and what that challenge means. And War on Want, we've always long understood, you know, this is not simply a UK phenomenon, right? It's a globalized phenomenon that we're seeing. We're seeing how the labor workforce is, how we see this global division of labor in its relationship all the way through from colonialism right through to modern day supply chains. And, you know, it's best illustrated, and of course, all of us have been aware of what that meant for example, for garment workers, which has perfectly illustrated the need for us to make sure our anti-racism and our solidarity work is truly international, as well as here in the UK, when we see, you know, the same racialized and gendered inequalities that mean, you know, garment workers in Leicester are being paid, are being exploited to the garment workers who are there in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and other places. And I want to maybe just end with focusing also on about the huge opportunity that exists for the trade union movement to really build on this opportunity, on this moment. And I totally agree with Pfizer that there's sometimes a lot that we take from the US, some of it not very helpful, but which is very, very helpful. And I think this opportunity to also think about how we organize that the freedom to win more freedom, right? How we organize, not just in the workplace, but in the community, and what role the trade union movement sees that. And as black workers, we've never seen a division between our fight in the workplace and our fight in our community, that the struggle against racism doesn't end at the factory gate, and neither does it end on the streets in our communities. And so, you know, we should celebrate clearly what's been amazing about the trade union movement and where the trade union movement has got it wrong or got it right. But I think we should also maybe spend a little bit of time on acknowledging where the trade union movement could have done better, where white worker racism has prevented the trade union movement from fulfilling its potential. And like Pfizer, I come to the Black TUC for both always being energized. But, you know, in my past, I used to work for New Monitoring Project. I've been involved with a lot of the struggles against racism, from Stephen Lawrence to John Charles Menezes to many countless deaths in custody. And the one place we could always rely on on trade union solidarity was, of course, the Black Trade Union, Black TUC conference, and of Black workers. It was Black workers who took those struggles into the trade union movement, who made the trade union movement stand in support of the Stephen Lawrence campaign, who connected the fight about institutional racism to the wider issues around structural inequalities. And you know, so this is not news for the Black workers. We've always had this sort of race class analysis, and in fact that we've always been the champions of intersectionality before that word was ever even coined. And we've always understood that the legacy of colonialism, of how it shaped our realities both here in this country but also of our countries of origin, and practice that internationalism in there. And I think there's a really important thing that we then also have to do, because we have to recognize that there's incredible new movements being emerging, right? And many of them are being led by young Black people, and mainly by young Black women. And there is an importance for us also to bring some of our analysis and of our understanding and of our historical context to those movements as well. So both in terms of the lessons we have in organizing, but also the lessons that we have in terms of the demands that we have, so that the demands that are being created, for example, the demands that we're creating around, you know, the fight around the climate crisis, actually center, you know, when we really mean a just transition, to what a justice transition would really mean, right? How do you fight for making sure that we're not just fighting for a living wage, but fighting for social protection, access to public services, workers' rights, and the fight against racism as being part and parcel of the climate fight? How do we make sure that in the fight, for example, around Black Lives Matter, that we don't see that the struggle in the workplace as being separate from the struggle we're seeing on the streets or against the statute? And there's a lot, therefore, that we should, you know, we should recognize is amazing work that's been done by Black workers, and the importance of bringing that back out into the movement. And I think there's a really important role, therefore, for the trade union movement as a whole and the TUC to make sure that when we talk about this justice transition, it's an anti-racist transition. When we talk about a green recovery to this economic crisis, it's actually got to be a Black, red, green recovery, right? It's got to tackle racism, it's got to tackle economic inequality, and it's got to tackle the climate crisis. And that our demands have to be integrated, and that we remind all of the trade union movement that on our banners, on every trade union banner, it doesn't say workers of England unite, it says workers of the world unite. And the importance, therefore, of our experience of bringing that Black internationalism to the fore. Now, Gloria did all the amazing quotes from so many of those who came before us, and I'm going to say, last night I was watching this documentary on Richard Pryor, and there was like an amazing moment where they have a clip of him being interviewed about racism in the media, and they asked him about racism, and he said, "It's capitalism, isn't it? It's capitalism that creates racism." And it just struck me that here was this cultural icon, who had an incredible political analysis and was sharing it on mainstream television. And of course, you know, we've shied away, I think, a lot of us in the progressive movements from really articulating what is the core of this crisis. And of course, that is capitalism. And I think we haven't to be afraid of actually being able to identify that. So I want to, you know, end with the quote of Fred Hampton, you know, of course, you know, that we fight racism by fighting with solidarity. And I think this is a really pivotal moment where we shape not just the future of the labour market, of workers, but of our society, both here in the UK and globally. And we've got to face up to that challenge. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Assad. Who said there wasn't more to say? There's always more to say. And solidarity and internationalism are some really important messages there, but also that interconnectedness, the multiple crises that we face, requires us to come up with an alternative set of solutions which actually cohere, make sense, and are really going to make a difference. Look, colleagues, we have run out of time, sadly, with this panel session today. I hope that, like me, that you found all of our panelists, their contributions extremely insightful, informative, but will also be a spur for the debates we're going to be having for the remainder of this conference. And as colleagues have said, you know, the Black Workers Conference is the powerhouse, perhaps. It's how we recharge the batteries of our trade union movement. And that's what we are going to be doing over the course of today and tomorrow. So I know that colleagues will have lots of food for gathered lots of food for thought from those contributions. Take that into all of the discussions, all of the debates that you're going to be having today and tomorrow, and let's build that agenda that we all know is so badly needed, an agenda which is going to make a difference not only for our Black members, for Black workers generally, but for all workers across our movement and beyond. So with that, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Faiza. Thank you, Debbie. And thank you, Assad. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into this one. And I'll see you throughout the rest of the Black Workers Conference this weekend. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.